Look at this. It is a sight that has spooked many people in different parts of the East County. Near El Cajon, some neighbors are calling him Chupacabra after the legendary creature.
Ladies and gentlemen, following on the news given in our bulletin a moment ago, the Government Meteorological Bureau has requested the large observatories of the country to keep an astronomical watch on any further disturbances occurring on the planet Mars.
In seconds.
What?
Is it a shape-shifting object? Is it Bezos? Is it Branson? What is it? Is it a UFO?
G'day everyone, artist Wayne Dowsett here, and it's time to weigh in on the Bigfoot phenomenon.
These men are consummate snowball artists. They use sense and nerve gases to induce hallucinations. People think they're seeing ghosts.
We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be talking about something very interesting. I'm a big fan of trying to look at natural explanations for the causes we see in the world around us. If it's someone saw Jesus resurrected from the dead, or Buddha walked on water, or Elvis Presley showed up, or aliens came and visited me last night, I kind of want to dig in and know, are they lying? Is it factual that they experienced something? What was that experience? Psychologically, mentally, I'm all into this stuff because at the end of the day, my experience tells me, and from my research, that there's always some natural means, even if it's hallucination, whatever, that explains these phenomena. And, I used to be superstitious all the way through and through. Well, today, I have a wonderful author and scholar, Robert Bartholomew, is joining us. And welcome to the channel. Robert, how are you, my friend?
Thank you. I'm doing fine.
Well, thank you for joining me. You have the book, Havana Syndrome, Mass Psychogenic Illness, and the real story behind the embassy mystery and hysteria. And I kind of want to let everyone see this just so they have a taste. They really need to get the book. I've been listening to it on Audible. So for those of you who are like me, who drive everywhere and you got to listen to a book, this is wonderfully read. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend Havana Syndrome. Get it. Check it out. You're going to hear things you probably never heard. I highly recommend this. So if you don't mind, Dr. Bartholomew, can you tell us a little bit about your background, what your expertise is, and maybe what Havana Syndrome is?
Well, for the past 35 years, I have specialized as a medical sociologist in the study of mass psychogenic illness and social panics. And when I saw this case, I thought to myself, wow, people, American diplomats in Cuba are being targeted with some type of sonic or microwave weapon. Isn't that terrible? And then the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this is a classic textbook case of mass psychogenic illness. So I got my PhD from James Cook University in North Queensland, Australia. The chairman of my PhD committee was Arthur Kleinman, the former head of social medicine at Harvard University. I have published arguably more studies on mass psychogenic illness in peer-reviewed medical journals over the past 30 years than probably anyone else alive. And it's very frustrating to me when I see people criticizing my work and saying I don't know what I'm talking about. And I'm ready to take on all questions and all comers because I think this is a really clear, unambiguous case of mass psychogenic illness. And with Havana Syndrome, you've got two things going on here. And it's confusing people. You've got what happened in Cuba from late 2016 into about 2018. And then you've got these cases around the world. And these are two separate events that are going on. One is clearly a case of mass psychogenic illness. The second event is driven by mass psychology, mass suggestion, because the Department of Defense and the State Department have issued warnings to millions of military personnel and diplomats around the world to be on the lookout for anomalous health incidents. And now anybody that gets up in the morning and is feeling a bit under the weather, and you work in the US military, or you're a diplomat or a CIA agent, now they're redefining all these common events as being related to Havana Syndrome.
So this is great because we're getting right into the meat. What's the difference between psychogenic illness and psychological suggestion? What can you first tell us what psychogenic illness is?
Yeah, think of mass psychogenic illness as the placebo effect in reverse. We're all familiar with the placebo effect. If I give you a sugar pill, tell you you're going to feel better, often you will. It's the power of belief. It's the power of expectation and framing. Now, it's not going to cure cancer or diabetes, but many conditions that people have are driven by anxiety, and it often has a major effect in those anxiety-driven conditions. There's also something known as the nocebo effect, where if I give you a sugar pill and tell you it's rat poison, there's a good chance that within a few minutes you might get headache, nausea, dizziness, you might even vomit, but there's nothing physically wrong with you. You can think of it as a software problem where you have an overstimulation of the nervous system.
It's interesting because I was watching Darren Brown, the magician, and he uses a lot of this placebo effect to show why beliefs and the suggestion of beliefs will cause people to do things they wouldn't have done before. And I could imagine you would want to reject something like rat poisoning and such. So now that we have the idea of a reverse placebo effect for being mass psychogenic illness, what is the difference between that and like mass psychological suggestion, where people are trying to, like you described?
Well, it's very similar, but in the cases around the world, what I think you're seeing is people simply redefining a variety of mundane conditions and ailments that they were going to have anyway under this new label of Havana Syndrome. Now, in Cuba, you have to really go back to patient zero, the first person affected. And that was the CIA officer in this small unit in Cuba. And he was talking with other CIA officers in October, November, December of 2016 about these unusual sounds they were hearing outside their homes at night. And then in December, one of them felt unwell. He had an earache, headache, and he went to the embassy clinic. And it's pretty typical of what you would find in a doctor's office all over the world, similar symptoms. But he made an interesting observation. He said, it seems like there's a beam of sound that's being directed at my house at night. And I think there might be some association with my symptoms. And they didn't think much of it, but then a couple of other CIA officers had noted that they had heard these similar mysterious sounds. And then this folk theory developed that they were being targeted with some kind of acoustical weapon from the Cuban agents who were down there. And you think, well, that's kind of a stretch, but there's a long history of Cuban agents harassing American diplomats in Cuba. It went on for a long time. When you woke up in the morning, you would go downstairs and on your kitchen table, you'd see cigarette butts, but you don't smoke. There might be dog poo on your kitchen floor and you don't have a pet. Some of the books in your bookshelf might have been rearranged. And they would even go so far as open up windows so all the mosquitoes come in. You go to park somewhere and someone parks behind you just a couple of inches so that you can't get out. Fairly low level stuff, but it was happening. And when the Obama administration opened up the embassy in 2015, they were conditioned to expect something like this because all of the diplomats going over there were warned. Number one, you're going to be under 24/7 surveillance. And number two, there's a long history of our agents and diplomats over there being harassed by the Cubans. So this was put in their minds. A rumor started that they were being targeted by these acoustical weapons. Initially, it was acoustical weapon because they were hearing sound. It spread like wildfire through the American embassy, and then the American embassy was sharing their information with the Canadians. So it then spread through the Canadian embassy as well.
Wow.
So you've got this going on, and it's a classic setup for mass psychogenic illness because they were telling people who were diplomats going home at night into their homes, because none of this happened at the embassy. It happened in their homes and in one of two large hotels. They were telling them, look, you may be the subject of an acoustical attack at night. Don't sleep near your windows. Sleep in the middle of the room. I mean, so you've got the normal stress of living in a foreign country, a hostile environment. You're under 24/7 surveillance. And now you're being told credibly by people in your embassy that you may be the subject of a sonic weapon that could hurt you and your children, because many of them had their children over there.
Right.
That, by any definition, is stress.
Okay. If I may, Dr. Bartholomew, I'd love to do a little analogy. I watched your interview with Mick West. He's a friend of mine. I've interviewed him on my channel as well. I like him. He tries to debunk, if you will, a lot of the UFO sightings, stuff like that. I'm big into that. I'm like Scooby-Doo, you know, it's a demon, it's a ghost, it's an angel. Nah, pull the mask off. You always find out there's someone behind it or something you didn't think it was. Well, in this case, I like to analogize to Christianity's origins, and trying to speculate is all we can do. But at the end of the day, I think of it, and I try to relate to my audience who's big on that, is you have a very stressful situation. You have someone's Lord, if you will, or their Messiah figure who dies. And I wonder if it's analogous or potentially analogous, since we're now discovering something that may go way back into history, as far back as who knows how far back we could potentially speculate on something like this. I wonder if there's mass suggestion. One person has an experience, maybe hallucinatory, post-mortem something, and there's this suggestion that they saw Jesus. So now everyone else is getting this suggestion, and they themselves are experiencing it. Do you, as a sociologist, a professional in the field, think this is a plausible explanation for the origins of Christianity?
I do. And, you know, some of the early encounters with Jesus after the resurrection, the description was that it was difficult to see the face. And that can be suggestive of hallucinatory type of events.
Interesting. I just wanted to ask, to analogize. Getting back to something, I knew a guy, I don't know if I should name him or not. I'll just put it this way for our audience, that he's a very well-known, very fringe figure in esoteric thought on the YouTube world. Well, I contacted him a few years ago in Skype, and he was definitely stressed. There was something wrong. Psychologically, I knew something wasn't wrong. And he started talking about how he was seeing fibers, and he went and saw his doctor in his skin, right? You mentioned this on Mick West's podcast about Morgellons. I think that's how we pronounce it. But he said he looked it up and he thinks the doctors are BS. No, there was really something going on. Now, he might have changed his mind by now, but he was really convinced at that time that he was seeing something on his skin and he couldn't sleep right. There was all sorts of stuff going on with him. How does that potentially relate to this mass psychogenic illness, if you will?
Well, you know, people often say seeing is believing. But I like to say believing is seeing, because believing alters your perceptual set and how you see the world. And then you start seeing things. If you believe in fairies, and look, there were thousands and thousands of fairy sightings in the 16, 17, 1800s, right? Where did all the fairies go? There used to be many, many sightings of sea serpents and big carvings and paintings. And where did all the sea serpents go? Human beings are very fallible creatures. We're prone to seeing things that aren't there, to believing things that have no objective reality, because we are meaning oriented. Look at the face on Mars. The belief by astronomer Percival Lowell that he was seeing canals on Mars. He mapped out this very complex system of canals. The famous case with the woman in New Mexico in the late 1970s, where she was cooking a tortilla on a skillet and burned it and thought she saw the face of Jesus. Now, never mind that no one knows exactly what Jesus looked like, assuming he was an historical figure. But or somebody seeing in the window of a church a reflection that looks like Jesus as well. So we have these perceptual sets that are altered by our beliefs. So then if I believe in Bigfoot, suddenly a rustling in the bushes at night becomes Sasquatch, or a wave on a lake becomes the Loch Ness Monster, or a light in the sky becomes a UFO. And these are all set up because human perception is very fallible. And a classic example is during the 1938 War of the Worlds scare. People were listening to the radio and believing that Martians were invading Earth. Now, it appears that not a lot of people panicked, but many people got scared and frightened by this broadcast. And during the broadcast, they described these Martians on these giant tripods firing heat rays and poison gas. There are documented reports of people calling the police to say that they can feel the heat rays as described on the radio. And they were actually choking on the phone and coughing, saying they could smell the poison gas, and were stuffing rags underneath the doors and in keyholes. So it's the power of expectation to alter our perceptual set. And because we're so fallible and prone to misperceiving things, there's the famous case of the Rotterdam panda a number of years ago, where this panda escaped from a zoo. And they were searching for it all over the city. And several days later, they found it. It was dead about 100 meters from where it had escaped, and it had been hit by a train. And it was very clear from the autopsy that it had died right away. But there were dozens of sightings all over the city and chasing it through people's backyards. What were they seeing? It wasn't the panda.
What about the recent situation that went on in America? I can't remember the exact name of the young lady who was murdered by her boyfriend, but he comes home, he drops the van off. His mom and dad are like, I do think that they would help him. Obviously, it's their child. But anyway, he goes off, and there's sightings all over the U.S. of this guy. Every time a dead body drops, they started having conspiracies. My wife was caught up in the drama, and she's like, they found a dead body where they thought they sighted the guy. Therefore, he's probably a mass murderer. And all this stuff started coming up, and I'm going, woman, just wait. Let's find out more facts. Let's see if we can find the guy. I thought he was hiding in a log cabin somewhere with a family member who probably was feeding him. That's probably what I would do. But this guy's out here, and they found his body. He's dead. Do you know which case I'm talking about?
Yeah. And look, the human mind does not work like a video cassette recorder. It interprets information as it takes it in. And all you have to do is look at an NFL football game or a baseball game. Umpires who are trained observers, have excellent eyesight, and know the rules, are constantly making mistakes because we are fallible. And when people say, well, CIA agents can't get mass hysteria, well, that's just not the case. We all have beliefs. And because we all have beliefs, we're all potentially vulnerable. With something like Havana Syndrome, what's fascinating to me is there are so many historical antecedents, links to the past, because, well, it's been said that history never repeats itself. It rhymes. And what we're seeing with Havana Syndrome is the rhyming of history. This is nothing new. There have been many cases similar to this in the past. And really, Havana Syndrome is the result of bad journalism, bad science, and bad government. All three of those have combined for the perfect storm.
Please tell us about those three a little further, if you don't mind. Take us into the examples you would give.
Well, I keep reading day after day for the past 4 years that the diplomats in Cuba suffered brain damage. That is absolutely, unequivocally not true. There is no evidence that they suffered brain damage. In the cohort they looked at, and this is in reference to the 2019 Journal of the American Medical Association study, they found that there were brain anomalies. Brain anomalies aren't the same as brain damage. It's not uncommon to have, in any given cohort, some anomalies. If we looked at all of your relatives today and looked at their teeth, I'm sure there would be some anomalies that would show up. So what you have here is a case of, when you look closely at that study, in the discussion section, they note that the anomalies were not so significant that they could not rule out the possibility they were caused by individual variation. Translation, they weren't very significant. Right. And so unfortunately, the neurologists have misinterpreted brain anomalies for brain damage, and those same anomalies are the types of anomalies you'd expect to find from people who are exposed to long-term stress, neurological symptoms. It's exactly the same type of symptoms that you had in Salem.
Wow. Okay. So bad science, bad journalism, and then you said something political. What was that in particular? I think you said diplomats or something.
Bad government. People.
That's right.
Yeah. People look at me and they go, "This guy doesn't know what he's talking about." Concussion-like symptoms, white matter tract changes, hearing loss, brain damage. This guy is an idiot. That's not mass hysteria, but that is not what happened. If you go look at the 2018 Journal of the American Medical Association study, the first one done on the patients, you'll find that before the study was even published, they had this information leaked to the press about a year before, saying they had found mysterious white matter tract changes in people's brains. But when the study finally came out in early 2018, I believe it was February, they only found 3 of the victims with white matter tract changes. 2 were mild, 1 was moderate. If you randomly pick 21 people on the street right now, you would have a similar breakdown. It's nothing unusual, because white matter tract changes are common in everything from depression to migraines to normal aging. And then they look at the hearing loss, and this was big news as well, that information was leaked to the press that about a third of the patients in the study that was going on had hearing loss. And then when the study came out, they found that there were only 2 patients had hearing loss, both of whom had pre-existing hearing loss before they went to Cuba. And what happened was they asked them if they had hearing loss, and about a third said they did. But when they actually did the objective hearing tests, only 2 had hearing loss, and they had the hearing loss before they even went there. That was the so-called University of Miami study that came out in December of 2018. But months and months and months before that study came out, the claims of hearing loss came out, and that got in the news for months and months and months. And then suddenly that study comes out, and it's in the news for a couple of days saying they didn't have the hearing loss. And then it just goes away. So now you got people out there believing there's brain damage, believing there's hearing loss. And look, concussion-like symptoms. If you look closely at the scans, it's very ambiguous, and there's no structural changes to the brain. So this is all very dubious. And what's really interesting to me is, over the past 4 years, you've gotten all this news coverage, most of which is, there's brain damage, all these things are going on. Now, all of a sudden, over, I'd say, the last 10 days, there's been a series of reports in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Times of London, opinion pieces suggesting that this might be mass psychogenic illness. Why has it taken so long?
You know how it goes. It takes a while before the Earth is actually not the center of the universe. It just takes a while for us to pull our head out of our butts. No, this is really interesting material. You mentioned in that previous interview with Mick, you mentioned Selma. You were talking about a historical situation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that situation and how that relates to what you're discussing?
Okay, I think you may be referring to this famous sociological study, the Seattle, Washington windshield pitting epidemic of 1954. And this is a classic incident where that year they had atomic bomb testing going on in the Pacific. And there was great concern all over the world from fallout from the atomic bomb tests, particularly on the west coast of the US. And rumors started that the fallout was coming down and contaminating the land. And a rumor started that the fallout was actually toxic and it could make indentations on your windshields. And this became a major scare where the governor of Washington State actually called President Eisenhower and asked for assistance. And so they had investigators study what was going on, and they studied the windshields. And what they found was there actually were pit marks on windshields all over the state of Washington. But those pit marks had been there all along. But instead of looking through your windshield, for the first time, people started looking at their windshields. And look, this is a classic setup for cases of Bigfoot sightings, UFO sightings, chupacabra sightings, because they usually start in a finite geographical area, and there is a sensational initial sighting, which gets social media play and or TV, newspaper, magazine, radio play. And so you have this sensational initial case that says there's a Bigfoot in your area. What do people do? Now people go out and they start scrutinizing their environment for where they ordinarily wouldn't scrutinize their environment. So now if it was said to be a UFO, people start staring at the skies and they start seeing things they ordinarily wouldn't see. And if you look at stars and planets long enough, particularly prominent ones like Venus, they can appear to move. It's called the autokinetic effect. They also can appear to change color. And people say, oh, I've never seen that before. It's changing from red to green to white and back to red again. No, you just haven't stared at the sky and stared at stars for long periods of time. And so people start seeing things that are always there. And the same with symptoms with Havana Syndrome. Besides the long-term stress that generated the neurological symptoms, you also have these secondary reports of people redefining common symptoms and some not so common symptoms that they were going to have anyway. And now anybody in the US military, all 2.9 members and their contractors as well, have been urged to report symptoms from Havana Syndrome. Well, the symptoms are things like brain fog, which is a classic symptom of stress, by the way. Symptoms like difficulty concentrating. I have that every day. They are so vague. Ear pain, insomnia. And that I predict that you're going to have tens of thousands of military personnel over the coming months flooding in with reports of Havana Syndrome. Plus you get the fact that there may be some compensation involved as well, right? So so people are taking ever-present symptoms and putting them under a new label, Havana Syndrome, which is a catch-all category for just about, somebody asked me, what are the symptoms of Havana Syndrome? I said, well, name a symptom. And it probably fits under the category. I mean, they are just so vague.
This is why I tell my wife I'm like, honey, don't go to the internet to diagnose your problem. She'll find go on Google. I have this red mark and I have a headache. And then she'll walk away. I'm going to die in 3 months. And I'm like, no, stop. Like, honey, you probably just have a migraine and a little pimple or something, something simple. I always try to be as optimistic, and she goes to the far end a lot of times thinking it's the worst. And I think that it's really fascinating what you said, because it touches on much more than just medical, much more than UFO sightings and Bigfoot. It's all, in my opinion, there's a case to be made that this, what is called Havana Syndrome, the power of suggestion, if you will, really, it goes far back, as far as recorded history probably is. What's the oldest known that you speculate? Because we can't prove it. I mean, we can only base it on evidence that we are looking at and try to interpret it our own way. Based on your research, what is the oldest known document or oldest known case you can think of that you would think that seems to fit Havana Syndrome of like what we're trying to talk about here?
Well, certainly during the Middle Ages, there were cases of dancing mania, St. Vitus dance, tarantism, where people claimed to get bitten by a tarantula spider, and the only cure was dancing to certain strains of music. These certainly seem to be psychogenic. So you go back to like the 11th century for stuff like that. There are some other vague reports earlier than that, but the 11th century, and then during the Middle Ages, there were hundreds and hundreds of cases of mass psychogenic illness, dozens and dozens of cases in medieval European nunneries, where it's important to note that there's two main types of mass psychogenic illness. You've got the cases today that are very common, that are triggered by exposure to what's perceived to be a harmful toxic agent. There's no pre-existing stress, and the symptoms usually go away within a few hours: headache, nausea, dizziness, fainting, hyperventilation. And then you have the cases like what's going on in Cuba, like what happened in Salem, Massachusetts in the 1690s during the witch hunts, where you have exposure to long-term stress. And that stress over time causes disruptions to the nerves and neurons that send messages to the brain. So you start getting twitching, shaking, altered states of consciousness. This is quite common in parts of Africa and Asia today. I mean, there are always cases every month that break out in parts of Africa and Asia where you get twitching, shaking, altered states of consciousness. And if there's a demon involved, it reflects the local beliefs. So it's the local demon. If it's in Islam, they might see a jinn creature. If it's Christianity, it's the devil, right? And very common. And this is the same thing that's happened in Cuba, but it's in a secular background. And so the backdrop there is not witches and demons, where most people in Western culture don't believe anymore, or are more skeptical. It's the belief in something that's equally implausible and speculative, and that is, oh, somebody must have a sonic or microwave weapon. But it really can't be a microwave weapon, because even though the National Academy of Sciences report, which came out, I think it was in December of 2020, they reported that the most likely explanation was pulsed microwave radiation involving the so-called Frey effect. The Frey effect is that your body is exposed to these microwaves, and you can perceive a barely discernible, what seems like a clicking sound. But here's the thing. It can't be the Frey effect, because they recorded it. And those recordings turned out to be the sounds of crickets and cicadas. And if you recorded it, it can't be, because you can't record the Frey effect. The Frey effect has these microwaves hitting your head, and they stimulate either a nerve in the ear or your brain. There's a debate as to which. And you perceive this sound. but it's not a sound at all. And it's barely discernible. That's not what the victims, the diplomats in Cuba, reported. They didn't report a barely discernible clicking sound. They reported high-pitched sounds, grinding sounds, low-pitched sounds. It's not the Frey effect. It can't be the Frey effect. And if it was the Frey effect, it would disrupt things like Wi-Fi. It would burn it out. It would turn computers off. None of that was reported in Cuba. It is just not possible. Yet the media continues to speculate that it's microwaves, and they continue to cite the National Academy of Sciences report.
Which you would suggest is mistaken, I heard you say. And obviously you would be willing to challenge and debate on that. Two things. The mind is so powerful. I mean, I'm finding that out more and more as I've been becoming more acquainted with the natural explanations, if that makes sense. I would be what you'd call a naturalist, someone who thinks that makes the most sense. But I think we all work within that frame, even if people have some other ontology. But I thought that the Salem witch trials and such was like triggered because of a poisoning in rye or something like that. Is that a myth?
That's a myth. Absolutely did not happen. You see people out there claiming that.
Right.
It's just not possible. It is just not possible. And I'll tell you why. If you look at the symptoms of the poisoning, where it's similar to taking LSD, right? And they have had people with ergot poisoning. There's a famous case of a village in France in the 1950s. The people that ingested the ergot from the rye were stark, raving crazy, trying to jump out of windows for days on end. They had to tie them down in beds. What happened in Salem is classic neurological mass psychogenic illness, because the girls involved had these twitching and shaking symptoms, right? And then they would go off, and then they'd be in the trial, they'd be in the courthouse, and all of a sudden they'd stop. Within a few minutes, they'd stop within all the girls, and they would act completely normally. That is not possible. That's like drinking a bottle of gin and then acting intoxicated. Yeah, being badly drunk, and then an hour later, somebody snapping your fingers and you're completely normal again. It is just not possible. And the other thing I want to mention was, when you had made reference to the National Academy report and stuff like that, I believe that if they were to interview the chairman of the National Academy of Sciences report, Mr. Relman from Stanford University, if they were to interview him today, he'd be much more skeptical. He gave a national public radio interview recently in which he said there was basically no evidence for pulse microwave radiation. And I thought, why did he suddenly become very skeptical of that? And I'll tell you why. Because through the Freedom of Information Act, recently the so-called Jason report from elite scientists was made public. And they looked very thoroughly at the Frey effect. And they said it's extremely unlikely, because you would have interference with other technologies. And the sounds that people were recording, it is impossible for that to be the Frey effect. And we now know that they were crickets and cicadas. So I think the National Academy of Sciences report has been discredited in terms of that. And the other thing I want to mention was, in that report, they said, we can't discount mass psychogenic illness, but there's no epidemiological evidence that we can evaluate. Well, that's not true. In our book on Havana Syndrome, which came out 8 months earlier, we documented the early epidemiological evidence on the spread. It's right there. And they ignored that as if it hadn't come out. The interesting thing with that study, which was about 70 some odd pages, they cited my research on mass psychogenic illness 11 times as an expert on mass psychogenic illness. Yet, very oddly, they just acted as if the book, which I wrote with UCLA neurologist Bob Ballo, had never come out, even though it came out 8 months earlier and had the information on the early epidemiological spread. And it suggests to me that there may have been some politics involved with the National Academy of Sciences study, because whenever you come out with a mass psychogenic illness diagnosis, there's always controversy. There's usually an uproar initially anyway.
So has that been your biggest backlash since you've produced this content? I mean, the book is absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend everybody go down in the description and get it right now. I mean, it's worth looking into these things. I think we're going to be mind blown in 100 years if we can stay on the path and continue to progress. But I think we're going to be mind blown on the things we'll discover if we continue down the science. It grinds slowly, but we're going to get there. And the question I have is, just simply put, what has been your biggest issue? What has been the biggest kickback? The reluctance to pay attention to your work? Or are there people writing critically against you? What would you say is the biggest difficulty you're having right now?
I think is they haven't read the book, and they have this idea, that there's brain damage, concussion-like symptoms, and hearing loss, so it can't be mass psychogenic illness. Let's just dismiss this guy off the bat. But the New York Times Magazine just came out within the last day or so, and they highlighted the research with Bob Ballo and myself in our book. So that's a big plus, getting it out there in a major publication. And it's just the misinformation that's in the media. My first job was as a journalist, a radio journalist in upstate New York in the late 70s and early 1980s. And journalists aren't experts on insect mating calls, sonic weapons, microwave weapons, all these different things, spycraft. And so you have to rely on experts. But in this case, the studies in the Journal of the American Medical Association, 2018 and 2019, they let us down. And I'll tell you, it's really odd, really, really odd, those JAMA studies and how they ever got published, because people may not realize the first study of the victims of Havana Syndrome that was done, they contacted my co-author, Bob Ballo, who is a prominent neurologist who created some of the tests they were using in that study. So they contacted him at JAMA and they said, can you review this study for us? And he did. And he rejected it emphatically. And they published it anyway. And he was just stunned that they would publish the study. And then he contacted me and he goes, look, I can't believe this happened. And by the way, I think this is mass psychogenic illness. You're the expert in mass psychogenic illness. Let's do a book on this. And we did. I think this is a classic case of science mixing with politics. And you also have mixed in here social panic, just like the witch scare, just like the communist scare. So in the communist scare, people started hearing these stories that, there's Reds under the beds. There's communists who have infiltrated the highest levels of American government. And now you start redefining situations, circumstances, and people as being, oh, that guy's a communist. Same is going on here with Havana Syndrome. And then people will say, oh, but I read in the internet that there's some kind of new microwave weapon that the Chinese have been working on, or the Russians have been working on. Well, don't you think if the Russians had been working on it, that they would have used it to quell some of the riots they've had in Russia or in Syria, or if the Americans were familiar with this technology, that they would have used it in Afghanistan? And you also have, what was that movie, The Men Who Stare at Goats?
Yeah.
Yes, the CIA looked at psi warfare, right? Psychic warfare, the paranormal, and they invested millions and millions of dollars into this. And it really reached a dead end. I have no doubt that the Chinese and the Russians have looked into acoustical weapons and microwave weapons. But if you look at the experts in these areas, they are extremely skeptical, because there's something called the laws of physics. If you had a acoustical weapon and you pointed it at one of those two large hotels in Cuba, and I've been there, they're massive hotels, and you tried to target someone in there It's just not possible. 99% of the sound waves would bounce off the outer wall. And then if you did it with microwaves, it would not be possible without burning out these different devices. And other people in the area would certainly know about it and feel it. But that's not the case. And by the way, Kenneth Foster, who did the pioneering research on the Frey effect in the 1970s, one of the foremost authorities. He studied it for 50 years. He told me the other day, he goes, it can't be the Frey effect. It's just not possible. It would defy the laws of physics based on what people are reporting. And yet you still get this out there. But I do sense that it's changing. It's changing over the last 10 days. And I think you're going to get a critical mass reached. There's always going to be controversy surrounding this, just like you have controversy about what Bigfoot, right? Or there's aliens at Hangar 18, right? But I think you will get a consensus soon among the mainstream scientific community that this is mass psychogenic illness.
You know, this is a fascinating discussion. We've touched on so many things, and there's so many more we could even get into. I was thinking about the recent 5G panic. People were saying the reason COVID was created, really, and that they were arguing. I mean, this just goes into conspiracy theories as well, because they were running around saying, and I can't remember exact details, each theory is a little bit different, but that COVID was a hoax to get everyone to go inside so that they could create these 5G microwave, highly dangerous, towers. They're trying to try this new thing of 5G, and everyone's got to go inside. It could potentially kill too many people. Did you hear anything about that at all?
Yeah, sure. And look, that's a common theme around recent social panics over the last century and a half. You've had a number of social panics, moral panics, that have revolved around new technology. When trains came out, you had railway spine, you had telegraphist cramp, you had telephone shock, where people were listening on the telephone, particularly telephone operators. There were crackling noises that were believed to cause concussion-like symptoms, very similar to Havana Syndrome today. And so you have all these things going on. When AM radio first came out, it was commonly believed that it was making people sick. When ice cubes were first coming out with refrigeration devices, many people wouldn't use them because they were afraid, because it was made by an artificial technology, artificial cold. So you always have these scares around new technologies, whether it's Wi-Fi, whether it's mobile phones, right? And so it's a very common hotbed area to have these things.
I just think that's so interesting. So to point out one more detail for people, conversion disorder versus group psychogenic illness, this mass psychogenic illness. Conversion disorder takes place with an individual. With what happened in Cuba, they're in a hotel. How many people did it start with? Just one person as kind of conversion disorder, but then spread? How did that work? And what is the difference for our audience in case they don't know conversion disorder?
Well, basically the same thing. But what happened with that first CIA agent appears to have been he just had some kind of earache and a common health incident. And he went to the clinic and he attributed it to the beam of sound he was hearing at night. And of course, when people started recording that beam of sound, they turned out to be crickets and cicadas. So you have this initial case where it's not conversion disorder, mass psychogenic illness, but the rumor started. And then it spread through the American embassy, and they warned embassy personnel that you may be the subject of a sonic attack. That's all you need. And now, anytime you hear an unusual sound, you're monitoring your body for any unusual symptoms. And so that's the redefining of ever-present symptoms. But you have the other factor there is you're under stress. You're in a hostile, foreign environment. You know you're being watched 24/7. And now you think you may be the subject of a sonic weapon, and your government agency is telling you this. You're being advised not to sleep near windows at night. It's that serious.
Yeah.
This is a classic setup for mass psychogenic illness, because over weeks and months under that stress, that's where you get the neurological symptoms developing. And that's what they were picking up in that second JAMA study, where they said they found anomalies, but they weren't particularly significant. And so that would explain that.
Oh, wow. There's so much here. I highly recommend, if you're enjoying this as I am, go down in the description and get the book, Havana Syndrome. Is there anything we've left out that we should mention to our audience before we end up going?
Well, you can go back in time. The initial belief was this was caused by acoustical sounds. And you can go back into the 1600s, where it was commonly believed that, particularly with women, that music would disturb their nervous system. And in the 1860s, Benjamin Franklin developed this instrument called the glass harmonica, where you'd spin around these glass spools and touch it with your wet fingers, and it would cause this very high-pitched sound. They still have glass harmonicas around today. And when that came out, they started to make them, and people gave concerts in the 1860s, 1870s, and a rumor spread that the glass harmonica could cure people of a variety of ailments. And people were going to these concerts and claiming that they were healed. And then one of the famous glass harmonica players in I think it was the late 1770s, reported that they were very sick. And then the rumor started that the glass harmonica was causing people to get sick. And then so it went from a placebo to a nocebo over the course of a few years. And then there were all kinds of reports of people going to concerts with the glass harmonica, getting sick, women fainting, claiming it was making their pets sick, like dogs as well. And so the power of the mind, the power of belief, the power of expectation is very strong, and it is well known throughout history.
This begs the question, since you've diagnosed this particular syndrome and realizing this illness, if I could use that term, just illness, how does one help to cure that situation that they're in? I guess, to use that term, how do you make someone who's experiencing that better? What's the best remedy?
The best remedy is belief, that you believe that this is psychological. And if you believe that, then the symptoms gradually dissipate over time with conversion disorder, mass psychogenic illness. And if you go back and look at the famous Leroy case in 2011, 2012 in Western New York, a group of mainly young schoolgirls were exhibiting twitching, shaking, vocal tics, where they had difficulty even completing a sentence. When that first came out, there was a huge hubbub when the New York State Department of Health diagnosed them as suffering from mass psychogenic illness. And then once that became accepted a few months later, the symptoms just gradually died down and dissipated. And that's what will happen here. But the fact that this has been stoked in the media over the last 4 years has really done a disservice to those people involved. And I'll say this, when recently Pamela Spratlin, who was the head of the Biden administration's investigation into Havana Syndrome, had a conference call with several victims of Havana Syndrome, and they asked her about the leaked FBI report, which concluded, as we did, that it was mass hysteria, mass psychogenic illness. They asked her what she thought of that, and did she think it was mass psychogenic illness? And she responded by saying, well, I'm holding open all possibilities, and the possibility that it's mass psychogenic illness. Well, there was such an uproar that within a few days, she was forced to resign her position because she had uttered the H word, hysteria. And, there's this belief that, oh, we're not crazy. We don't have a mental disorder. Mass psychogenic illness, conversion disorder, is not a mental illness. It is a collective stress response, and we are all potentially vulnerable because we all hold beliefs.
Wow. I think that we all, in some ways, even hallucinate, right?
Well, supposedly the most common hallucination is hearing your name called. It's like, yep, what did you want? And then it's like, I didn't call your name, but you heard your name called, right?
Right. And it's like no physical activity taking place. There's no reaction to it to where someone can go, you just hallucinated. I saw that. And you forget. From what I understand, my father had like 27 of them in my life. I've watched him, and he always would forget what led up to that seizure.
Yeah, and look, there's so many phenomena out there that are natural phenomena. And well, they're not expecting a supernatural explanation here. It almost is, because it's a science fiction explanation they're looking for. And there's just no evidence of some type of acoustical or energy weapon. And again, if it was a microwave weapon, you would expect to have interference with Wi-Fi. You would have problems with computers. People aren't reporting that.
That's a really good point. Makes me just kind of want to reevaluate people and their beliefs and why we do believe what we do. I mean, even though I'm no longer a theist, right? I get into this world, as I brought this up briefly with you. I think there's definitely power in what we're believing and why, and how we're going about these things. I understand why people desire, for example, Christianity or whatever their belief might be. I came out of Christianity, so that's why I always discuss this. But in particular, it makes me want to reevaluate why people believe in gods to begin with, and what the whole point of this stuff what is. I've had Dr. Andy Thompson on. He wrote a book called Why We Believe in Gods. And he goes into agency and some of the evolutionary products, if you will, to why we take just a leap further into believing these things that may or may not be there. At the end of the day, this seems to fit hand in glove with what you're hypothesizing here. And it's not just a hypothesis. I suspect this is proven fact that people are experiencing this. But it fits into this because this whole stress and reaction mechanism, is this not an evolutionary byproduct of us as a social creature developing and surviving through tough situations throughout history?
Well, the Thomas theorem in sociology, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. And I would argue that also applies to women as well. That was written in 1923, I think. And yes, and because we are so fallible, we're so vulnerable to seeing things that aren't there based on our mindset. And that also applies to religion as well. If people define situations as real, they're real in their consequences. And you often hear people say, when they got religion, so to speak, life changed for them. Mm-hmm. And it can be life-changing to, for the first time, maybe in a long time, have self-confidence, a belief in yourself, because self-confidence will take you a lot further than not believing in yourself. And there's a great quotation. I want to read it for you. It's very short. Walter Lippmann said, under certain circumstances, men respond as powerfully to fictions as they do to realities. And in many cases, they help to create the very fictions to which they respond. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. People see what they expect to see, what they want to see, what they hope to see. Just like UFOs and Bigfoot. I see UFOs and Bigfoot as anti-scientific symbols in a secular age, whereas science says essentially Bigfoot can't exist, right? There's no fossils, there's no body, there's no DNA evidence. But Farmer Joe down the road saw Bigfoot. I went to school with Farmer Joe. I believe him. Seeing is believing. And look, science says Bigfoot doesn't exist. Well, if they got Bigfoot wrong, maybe they got religion wrong as well.
Right.
And so it goes on from there. I mean, a lot of it is common sense. I mean, with ghosts, for instance, it's not just that you saw a ghost, it's potentially proof of life after death. So there's a need or a want to believe. There's a lore there, isn't there? But I always say with ghosts, if ghosts are real, how come they're not naked? How come they're wearing clothing?
It's interesting. Yeah, there's I think they're projecting. There's this projection of our experience and what we would expect. But I also say the same thing about God, you know. I like to go here, but there's this phrase, you know, you've heard it before. Man was created in the image of God. And I believed this for a couple decades of my life. And what ended up happening for me is I started looking at comparative religions and things and started to recognize mythology for what it is. And I was in an extreme fundamentalist school of thought. So when you find out that stuff, you go straight to the bottom. You don't really like, okay, I'm going to become more liberal. Like you try to, but you realize, hold on, I'm willing to evaluate the whole damn thing. And when I did, I then started realizing as I looked into naturalism and the phenomenon of why people believe, going from animism to polytheism to monotheism, I realized really quickly, no wonder God has an arm. God used to have a wife in the Bible, you know, Asherah, which was divorced. He had a wife, he had an arm. There's a scholar named Francesca Stravakopoulou, who's a Hebrew professor, and she's writing a book called God and Anatomy. And God has a body like humans, and not just like any body. It is like the same shape as we are. And so you say to yourself, well, one can argue and try to take this and say, no, God's outside space and time. I think they're moving the goalposts to try and hide God from science and realizing we don't need it. But anyway, that's my own personal jab. But at the end of the day, why does God look like man? Well, they go, because God made man in his own image. Some people will say that argument. Others will say that meant something else, morally or spiritually or something. But at the end of the day, I now say God is made in the image of man, just like ghosts look like us. And all these other things have similar features. Demons not only look like humans, but they're a mixture of humans and wild beasts that we're afraid of. You know, they combined these interesting images and our imagination. But one thing you said in that quote that I'd like to get your thoughts on is we want to believe in these things. That's the crazy thing. We want, like, there's an exciting thing when I go to watch Iron Man. I know it's fiction, but I love thinking there's a hero out there with a suit on who's ready to take out the bad guy. But we do that even, people like scary stuff, people like this. So we want the suggestion of belief in these things out there in the night and you name it.
Yeah, if Havana Syndrome did not exist, it would be necessary to invent something similar, you know, to paraphrase Voltaire, and to take some license with him, because Havana Syndrome in part is a social panic. And it's a social panic that involves fear of new technology. It's a social panic that involves fear of foreigners and, you know, the enemy. And so we are continuously creating these, inventing these social panics. And we're always in some social panic, and we go leap from one to another, often overlapping. You know, the satanic ritual abuse panic during the 1980s and early 90s. I mean, that's a very well-known one with religious overtones. And so there's this lore out there, this, it's the way humans are created, I think. It's part of the human condition.
That's what I'm saying. And one person might say, well, Dr. Bartholomew, God created us that way. Okay, I'm not going to argue with it, right? They think that's how man was created. I, on the other hand, think that in our evolution as a species, this is part of our survival mechanism. If they have that saying, that old saying, it says, there's two people, and the one who believes they can and believe they can't, and they're both right. Like, it is this idea, like, if I will do everything I can to survive. And I'm a recovering heroin addict. I didn't tell you this, but I almost died of heroin addiction about 6 years ago. And I actually was injecting at the end. And 6-year anniversary was on October the 25th. And I started to believe in myself, like you mentioned earlier in this episode. But I got off the heroin, and I really felt survival was necessary. I didn't believe in evolution and stuff before that. I had no scientific, I didn't care. I was a Bible-believing young earth creationist about 8 years ago. So I was believing that the earth was 7,000 years old and we were created 7,000 years old. Evolution wasn't true. All of these things, I wouldn't even be sitting here talking to you today if it weren't for all of it.
That's really fascinating. And the other observation I just want to make is there's a anthropologist in Australia who has a theory about Bigfoot, and that is we now know that unless we're from sub-Saharan Africa, we all have some Neanderthal DNA. And the theory is that when humans, obviously Homo sapiens, had sexual intercourse with Neanderthal, the theory is that it wasn't necessarily consensual. And so, they were terrorizing humans. And because of that, there might be some built-in evolutionary mechanism whereby people all over the world are predisposed to seeing, particularly at nighttime in ambiguous situations, in forests, large, hairy, ape-like creatures. And that's an interesting theory. I mean, people see Bigfoot all over the world. It's roughly similar, and yet there's no body, fossils, bones, or DNA record. So that's just food for thought.
Yeah, one more thing. Andy Thompson, that I actually spoke to earlier tonight. He's spoken at the Richard Dawkins Foundation and all of this. He wrote a book called Why We Believe in Gods. And he told me on an episode, I don't know how factual this is, I'm just relaying the information. And he said, Derek, when you go to sleep at night and you ever have that moment where you're falling off the cliff and you jerk and then you catch your breath, right? So obviously you're like panicking and you wake up for a second and then you're like, all right, I'm going back to sleep. 5 million years ago, all right, for millions of years, we lived in the canopy of trees. And he said, all of our enemies were always under us, under the bed. And he said, we always had that dark lurking creature at night that was trying to take us, to get us. And we had to, for survival means, cling for life and try not to die. But we'd sleep in these trees, and sometimes we'd fall out of the tree. And we're a social creature, so we probably witnessed in our own life, in our own family, someone who fell. And when they fell, they died from a creature potentially or from the fall itself. So that mechanism of always falling and coming back may be an evolutionary byproduct from our past, just like you're talking about. Don't know how true it is, but Dr. Andy Thompson mentioned that, and I just figure I'd add that to the food for thought as well.
Yeah, well, there's something to be said for biological evolutionary mechanisms, right? Like cats, right? You're familiar with that, where they had a study of cats falling off buildings in New York City years ago, and like a third of them survived, like 20, 30, 40 story falls, because they suck in all their organs and the fleshy part hits the pavement, and they often survive because cats have evolved in trees, where dogs don't stand much of a chance 1 or 2 stories, but cats do.
Wow, interesting. These are so much. I love this, and I really want to have you come back. I think what we'll do is you let me know down in the comment section. I hope you guys get the book, and that way Dr. Bartholomew will definitely want to come back onto MythVision so we can kind of talk about how all humans are having these suggestions and beliefs and go into this. But I'd love to do a live with him, family. So leave a comment, go get his book, give him every reason to come back, and we'll maybe do a live and hang out with you guys, take your questions, do Q&A, go on rabbit trails in the discussion and things like that. But yeah, I seriously appreciate you. This has been a blast.
Yeah, and I just have to make an observation, Derek. I mean, your life history is remarkable, and I commend you for what you've done, and it's incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, there's more to it. I'm sure I could fill you in on, but I survived, and I'm still trying to. My biggest thing is I want to help people realize whatever you believe at the end of the day, and it's okay. I believe in things. I believe in myself. I believe in my wife. I believe in my kids. Like, we all have beliefs in particular things, but I want people to know that there is a life outside of these superstitions that we've been taught, and that the same hardware and software can work apart from those superstitions. And that is the thing I think we've been touching on a little throughout this episode is, the hardware's there, and they want to act like the hardware was created by the superstitions or by the software. And I'm suggesting, no, we can develop our own software as we learn as humans and develop and learn to try and break beyond the superstitious boundaries that cause us to divide and treat each other in ill ways. It's one of the things my motivations are. So
that's great.
Thank you. I appreciate you, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, I gotta share the picture here, let you guys see the book. I really hope you guys will check it out. I'm having a blast reading this, and leave a review, leave a positive review. Authors that come on my channel, I don't mention this enough. If you leave a review, it gets suggested. it gets a mass suggestion from Amazon, and they push it out to a larger audience so that people can have that same psychosomatic. No, I'm just kidding. Seriously though, it gets a broader audience, and it helps the authors, in the long run. And if you like what you heard, please take the time to do that. Is there anything you'd like to touch on this?
No, other than, what I said about history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And that's what we try to do in the book. We show the historical antecedents of Havana Syndrome. And, going back into the Middle Ages, that this is nothing new, and it's been happening for a long time.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Bartholomew. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are lost and you don't know your way and you need something to believe in, here's a little chant for you. We are MythVision.
What do you think I should do?
Lenny, officially, the church will not take any position on the religious implications of these phenomena. Personally, Lenny, I think it's a sign from God.